Ava, Bella, and Chloe Rowe were three sisters full of life, laughter, and plans for the future, until a weekend camping trip with their estranged, homeless father ended in a discovery so horrifying it shook the entire town of Timber Falls. What began as a chance to reconnect became a nightmare of blood-stained tents, carved trees, and a forest hiding more than just shadows. In early July 2019, the quiet town of Timber Falls, Oregon, was settling into the rhythm of summer when three young sisters, Ava, 14, Bella, 11, and Chloe, 9, left for what was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Their destination was Pine Hollow, a heavily wooded area about an hour outside town, known for its scenic beauty, hidden trails, and almost complete lack of cell service. It wasn't an ideal choice for most families, but to the girls, it sounded like an adventure. What made this trip unusual, and ultimately tragic, was who they were going with, their estranged father, Mark Rowe. Mark hadn't been a part of the girls' lives for over 4 years. Once a respected firefighter, Mark's life had unraveled. After the death of his wife, the girl's stepmother, in a house fire that many whispered he may have caused. Though never formally charged, Mark was never quite the same. He drifted into alcoholism, lost his job, and eventually ended up living in his van, parking near local shelters or deep in the woods. Denise Morgan, the girl's mother and sole guardian, had always kept him at a distance, believing he wasn't stable enough to be around them. But in recent months, Mark had started reaching out, leaving messages, writing letters, even showing up at Ava's school once. Denise resisted. But something changed that summer. Mark claimed he had found sobriety, found faith, and was trying to become a better man. He said he wanted to make up for the lost years. He asked for just one weekend with his daughters. He promised it would be safe, just some time in nature, no pressure, just memories. After a long conversation with Ava and a court order that technically didn't bar contact, Denise gave in. She packed them each a bag, told them to stick together, and watched as Mark's beat-up sedan pulled out of the driveway. At a gas station near the entrance to Pine Hollow, a clerk later remembered seeing them, so he said the girls looked cheerful. Ava was taking pictures with her old digital camera, and Chloe was holding a marshmallow bag like it was a prized possession. Mark paid for gas and supplies with a handful of wrinkled bills and a small jar of change. He smiled, thanked the clerk, and said something about one last great weekend. That strange choice of words would take on a much darker meaning later. The weather was clear that Friday afternoon, the sun filtering through thick pine trees as they drove deeper into the woods. They set up camp near a clearing with a small stream nearby, surrounded by tall trees and silence. Neighbors later said they heard laughter echoing through the forest that evening. But by Sunday night, everything had gone quiet. When Denise didn't hear from them by Monday morning, she tried calling Mark's phone. No answer. She waited, thinking maybe they were still in the woods with no signal. But as the hours passed, her worry turned to panic. By the time police arrived at Pine Hollow, the campsite looked like it had been attacked. Nothing about that trip had gone the way anyone expected. By Monday evening, Denise could no longer convince herself that everything was fine. The camping trip was supposed to end Sunday night, and Mark had promised to return the girls by early afternoon. But now his phone went straight to voicemail, and none of the girls' phones were reachable. Denise called every number she could think of: Mark's old co-workers, a few of his remaining friends, even shelters he used to frequent. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. She finally called the police and filed a missing persons report for all 4 of them. At first, authorities treated the situation like a custody issue. Mark didn't have legal visitation rights, and it seemed like he may have simply run off with his daughters. These kinds of situations usually ended with the kids returned unharmed after a couple of days. But something felt different to the officers assigned to the case. Denise was frantic, not just worried. She told them that Mark wasn't stable, that he'd been homeless for years, and that he had once hinted at disappearing into the woods forever. When deputies arrived at Pine Hollow the next morning, they expected to find an empty campsite. What they found instead changed everything. The campsite was a mess. The tent had been slashed open down one side as if someone had cut it from the outside. 3 sleeping bags were laid out, 2 inside, 1 half outside the tent. Nearby, the campfire pit was still warm, and half-melted marshmallows sat beside a rusted cooking grate. But it was the blood that alarmed investigators. Large, uneven, stains soaked into the dirt around the sleeping bags and a nearby log. A pair of broken glasses was found, later confirmed to belong to Bella. One of Chloe's shoes lay abandoned several feet away, its laces snapped. Search teams were called in immediately. Over the next 3 days, Pine Hollow was combed by over 100 people. Volunteers, police, dogs, and even a drone unit provided by the state. The terrain was difficult, steep slopes, thick brush, and hidden creeks that made travel slow and dangerous. No bodies were found, no signs of life. But then a grim discovery surfaced near the edge of the forest, a silver heart-shaped locket engraved with the name Chloe, partially buried under a mound of leaves. It was scratched and scorched, as if it had been in a fire. News of the disappearance spread quickly. Television stations ran segments about the 3 missing sisters. Pictures of Ava, Bella, and Chloe flashed across screens, smiling and unaware of what was to come. Mark's image was released to the public, labeled as armed and dangerous. People assumed he had snapped, perhaps killed his daughters and fled into the woods. Others speculated he might have taken them deeper into the forest to start some twisted new life. But as more time passed, authorities began to question that theory. There was no trace of Mark either. No footprints, no food supplies, not even discarded wrappers or water bottles. It was as if all 4 of them had simply vanished. 2 weeks after the girls vanished, hope was fading fast. The search had become more desperate and less organized. Some officers were quietly reassigned. Volunteers began to stop showing up. The media turned its attention to new headlines. But then came a break, grim and unexpected. A fisherman hiking near an old quarry 10 miles southeast of Pine Hollow noticed something strange. The corner of a vehicle barely visible beneath the murky surface of the quarry pond. Authorities were called in. When they pulled the vehicle from the water, it was identified as a white 1998 Dodge van, registered to Mark's older brother, Peter Rowe, who lived 2 states away. Peter hadn't seen Mark in years, and was stunned to learn his van had been stolen months ago. Inside the van was a collection of disturbing clues. In the back seat lay Ava's torn backpack, still containing her journal and a cracked tablet with its battery dead. Beside it was one of Bella's sandals, soaked and covered in algae. Most haunting of all were 3 burned notebooks, each filled with handwritten entries. The journals belonged to the sisters. Much of the writing was illegible from fire damage, but several pages were preserved. Investigators read entries describing the early days of the trip, hiking, roasting marshmallows, watching birds. But the tone changed abruptly halfway through. The last entry, believed to be Ava's, ended mid-sentence. "Someone is outside the tent again. I can hear the breathing." Equally disturbing was a hand-drawn map, found sealed in a plastic bag, hidden beneath the front seat. The map showed the Pine Hollow region with red X's marked on several points. One of them was labeled Dead Man's Pocket, a secluded, overgrown section of the forest few people ever visited. Locals called it Cursed, a place where hikers occasionally went missing. The map also included a crude sketch of trails and a marked location labeled Safe Spot. Acting on instinct and desperation, a small team of officers followed the map into the dense undergrowth. After nearly 4 hours of hiking through thick brush, they stumbled across a hidden shelter, made of scrap metal, tarps and branches, camouflaged with moss and dirt. It was eerie and silent, with signs of recent use. Inside were rusted tools, an old kerosene lamp and something worse, dozens of photographs spread across a plastic sheet. They were pictures of the 3 girls clearly taken during the trip. Some showed them smiling around the fire. Others were zoomed in through the trees, as if taken without their knowledge. In none of them did Mark appear. One photograph showed Chloe crouched near a stream, looking behind her as if she had heard something. Another showed Ava sleeping in the tent, the photo taken from just outside the flap. Whoever had taken them had been close, very close. The camera used to take the pictures was not found at the shelter, but something else was, a pile of freshly stripped bark with deep carvings. Some were symbols, some were names. All were chilling. The name Chloe appeared 5 times, carved deep, the wood stained with something dark. As investigators continued to search the makeshift shelter, hidden deep in Deadman's pocket, the evidence grew more unsettling. While they initially believed Mark Rowe had constructed it, forensic analysis soon told a different story. DNA samples were taken from various items, mattresses, tools, even the bark carvings. One blood sample found on a jagged piece of metal matched Mark's, but another set of DNA, collected from the rope, food containers, and discarded clothing, belonged to someone completely unexpected, Thomas Weller. Weller's name hadn't been mentioned in years. He had once been a suspect in 2 disappearances, both hikers who vanished in national parks in 2003 and 2004, but no evidence ever tied him to a crime. He had dropped off the grid shortly afterward, declared missing, presumed dead by some. But now it seemed he had never truly left the woods. Somehow, he had remained hidden all this time, surviving in silence, possibly hunting people who crossed his path. The revelation shifted the entire investigation. Mark Rowe, once the main suspect, was now possibly another victim. Authorities pieced together a new theory. Mark had taken the girls into the woods, but they weren't alone for long. Somewhere along the trail, likely not far from their campsite, Thomas Weller found them. It wasn't clear whether he followed them deliberately or stumbled across them by chance, but his presence at the shelter suggested he had taken control of the situation, turning the forest into a trap. After the shelter was discovered, officers installed hidden cameras along nearby trails, hoping Weller might return. Within days, one camera captured a grainy black-and-white image of a tall, gaunt figure watching a group of hikers from a hilltop. The man was barefoot, dressed in ragged clothes, and appeared to be holding something, possibly a long hunting knife or a walking stick. His face was turned away from the camera, but his body language suggested he was observing, not passing through. Around the same time, strange reports started coming in from locals. A man in a tattered coat was seen moving through the trees near a remote ranger station. Children heard whistling at night that didn't come from any animal. A farmer discovered a rabbit snare baited not with food, but with a child's shoelace tied in a bow. Every sighting pointed to someone watching, waiting, someone who had learned how to disappear. Forensic artists reconstructed Weller's appearance based on old photos and age progression software. The image released to the public showed a bearded, hollow-cheeked man with sunken eyes and deep lines across his face. Tip lines lit up, but none of the sightings could be confirmed. Weller had become a phantom. One detective described the feeling in the woods as unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The deeper they searched, the more it felt like Weller had built a world of his own, one with no roads, no rules, and no way out for anyone who wandered in uninvited. 3 months after Ava, Bella, and Chloe disappeared, the investigation had reached a grim plateau. Despite renewed efforts and national attention, no new breakthroughs had come. Mark Rowe was still missing, presumed either dead or in hiding. Thomas Weller remained a ghost in the trees. Then, in mid-October, a hunter walking through a dried-out creek bed on the southern edge of Pine Hollow noticed something unusual: a ring of small stones arranged in a perfect circle. In the center, the dirt was disturbed, slightly sunken in, and dotted with fallen leaves that hadn't quite settled naturally. The hunter contacted the authorities. A team arrived the following morning to excavate the area. What they uncovered brought the search to a devastating end. Beneath just 12 inches of dirt lay the bodies of all 3 girls. They were wrapped in a faded blue tarp, their hands bound with coarse twine. Blindfolds had been placed over their eyes, scraps of an old flannel shirt torn into strips. All 3 showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. Forensic analysis indicated they had been killed within 48 hours of their disappearance. Nearby, hidden under a rotting tree stump, was a rusted chain. Investigators followed its length through a tangle of roots until it led them to a second grave, shallower, hastily dug, and filled with rocks. Inside was the decomposing body of Mark Rowe. His hands were tied behind his back, and a large wound was visible on the side of his head. The coroner later determined he had died days after the girls. His body showed signs of restraint and prolonged physical stress. Despite his troubled past, it became clear that Mark had not murdered his daughters. He had died trying to protect them. Around the graves, police found small items: a piece of Bella's favorite bracelet, Ava's broken hairbrush, and a worn-out stuffed animal Chloe had taken everywhere. All were arranged as if part of some twisted ritual, carefully placed, not discarded. What disturbed investigators the most was a trail of charred matches forming a line from the creek bed to a nearby ridge. At the end of the trail, pinned to a tree with a nail, was a piece of bark. Etched into it were 3 stick figure drawings, 1 tall and 2 smaller. All had X's for eyes. The discovery of the bodies changed the tone of the investigation. What had once been a manhunt became a recovery mission and a psychological puzzle. Experts in criminal behavior were brought in. Some suggested that Weller saw himself not as a killer, but as a judge or gatekeeper, acting out a deranged sense of justice in the wilderness. Others believed he had simply become a predator, one shaped by years of isolation, detached from reality and incapable of empathy. Despite extensive searches, Weller was never found. The forest gave up its victims, but not its monster. Months later, hikers reported strange sightings again: shadows slipping behind trees, distant whistling, and the smell of smoke with no fire in sight. Some believe Weller died alone in those woods. Others believe he's still out there watching from the darkness, waiting for his next visitors to wander too far from the trail.